So it's a great pleasure and honor for me indeed to be a plenary speaker here at your meeting, the very first meeting here in Europe, as I heard. Excellent. I'm an evolutionary biologist, but mainly a behavioral ecologist, which means that I try to study ecology, so the interaction between organisms and their environment, and particularly focusing on their behavior, trying to understand how organisms, animals in particular, deal with their environment. In particular, when environments change, what are the consequences and how can they respond, interact, first through their behavior. We also focus on some life history traits as well, as we really want to understand lifestyles of organisms in the wild. And the particularly interesting thing from my perspective is, as we, as an interesting organism as well, as you know, we do change a lot in our environment. What are the consequences for the other creatures? How do they respond? What is the kind of response they can show, and focusing particularly on the information they can use? That will be a kind of key topic of today. And of course, as given the profile of your meeting, I will particularly focus on experimental settings. I will walk you through some ideas, but show some results and particularly show some approaches we like to use for this kind of questions. It's about complexity. Nature, wildlife is so fascinating but complex. And what we try, and therefore I think that several of the approaches we use are apparently also very fascinating for the general public. I spent quite some time also like in media and for the general public to show how different insects and birds and mammals, how they behave and how we can learn something from it and how we change things in a way that is not necessarily visible to our own eyes. So there is quite some mystery involved as well if you wish, but that's what science is about, isn't it? Okay, so behavioral ecology, which means that in my team, I'm at the University of Louvain-la-Neuve, south of Brussels, here in Belgium. Since 15 years, I have my own lab there on behavioral ecology, often within a framework of nature conservation, but also quite fundamental work, trying to understand what are the organisms doing and why are they doing what they do. And to what extent this may change when environmental conditions do change. We mainly work with insects and birds. I particularly show some results on our butterfly work. But I'll briefly mention some of the work on birds as well, mainly work done on shrikes, the red-backed shrike as a kind of interesting species. But overall, that means that we do quite a lot of field work, doing observational work on the one hand, and then in a very artificial environment in the lab. But of course, we are extremely interested in doing along those gradient of very natural settings versus laboratory settings, trying to play in the intermediate zone, trying to simulate things that look, from our perspective, are not necessarily very natural, but they do work for the organisms we are trying to understand. I will try to make that a bit more clear. So if I summarize the work we are doing, it's about understanding changing organisms in changing environments, and particularly environments that are changed by intensive human land use, urbanization, agriculture, etc. And for that kind of things, Belgium is a useful place, because there's quite some changes going on indeed. Okay, let's start with the typical Belgian landscape. For those who are not laughing, I mean, of course it's not the Belgian landscape, but it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. What I really want to address here is there is an organism and there is the environment. And in our kind of simple mind, it's very clear-cut. That's the organism, that's the environment. Isn't it? Well, yes, but it's, of course, our perspective. One of my handicaps, and I will limit today just to one of my handicaps, if you agree, is that I'm human. Well, it's fine to be human, it's not a problem, but as a biologist, it's a kind of handicap. Because if I want to understand this creature, then I assume that what I see is what this guy sees, which is an assumption. Is it true? Is my perception of the environment, landscape, habitat, etc., really of any significance to the organism I want to understand? Even if you think about the definition of a landscape, that's already, and there are several, of course, you can say, well, a kind of scenery, that's what I see at a particular place. So what I see, but is what I see what the others get? I think that's a very important key question, and it really is a very fundamental aspect that's not only exciting for academics, but I really think it shows some critical elements that are important to understand environmental change and what it really means, because there are a lot of problems that we even don't see, literally. And I will try to address this. So the big thing we often forget is that in all the work we do, fundamental work, applied work, there is a big assumption, the WYSIWYG assumption, as we could call it. What you see is what you get. Is it? We are looking to it. We are doing observations. We are seeing colors. We are smelling. It's chemical information. But is this the information the organisms get? And of course, we can use apparatus and different techniques. Then we can see things that we do not see ourselves, etc. But we are getting in a kind of virtual reality, which is reality for the other creatures that we try to understand, that we like to conserve or destroy in case they are causing problems, etc. So I really think this is a very basic assumption in ecology or general in environmental sciences, that the human perspective is the dominant perspective. What we see is what they get. It can be true, but often it's not necessarily so. And I think that's a very exciting basic assumption that we could question. And also for the general public or students, trying to entertain them with these kinds of questions. I see a forest. If I was a caribou or a butterfly, how does it feel to be a bat or something like that? And that looks like something, well, that's like a game. No, these things can be very serious scientific questions, indeed. And I think that's really exciting. And these are one of the things we're trying to do in our team. And the basic idea of this is not novel. It's not new. And sometimes that's something I try to stimulate with my students. And they say, oh, the old professor is there as well. I said, sometimes there's some great stuff in very old books. Books, you know, so paper, you know, these kind of very old books. Library, yeah, okay. I'm joking, but of course, this guy is Jakob from UHasselt. And he wrote a fantastic book in German, 1909, a while ago, isn't it? Umwelt und Innerwelt der Tiere. Umwelt is actually the German word expression for environment. But what he did, he was really interested in animal behavior, but from a kind of psychological point of view, which again is a kind of, I mean, some of the things we're dealing with, if you really want to understand how an animal is dealing with the environment, it's animal psychology. And of course, a part of the behavior is how it is responding, what's the information that is available for the organism, how can it respond, and how it will deal with it also at the cognitive level, of course. What he worked like with ticks. And one of the questions or examples he addressed was, well, what's the information of a tick? How does the world look like for a tick? Sitting in a forest or at a forest edge, there are no eyes, they have some visual information, but how does the world look for a tick? And how can we understand this? How can I make a kind of adjusted perception to understand ticks and how they interact with hosts and the environment? This is really, so Umwelt, although Umwelt is environment, he gave a very specific interpretation through the eyes of a particular organism. So it is an organism-centered sensory environment, which means that I hope for the moment that I'm a part of your Umwelt at this very moment, which means that this is the environment But there is a lot of information, but all of you will pick some information from it. The same is true for the organisms. And when they have different evolutionary histories, they will pick up different things. And we are not dealing with the same information. So I think this is a crucial insight. And sometimes it's nice to get these old ideas back in the new literature, which was one of the things we did a few years ago in this paper in evolutionary applications, where we really tried to show the significance of this long-standing idea, Umwelt, which I will develop a bit further. So here I'm back with this gradient. You can work in the field. It can be a forest, we all agree. You can work in the field. High level of realism, because that's what I want to understand. I'm not working with chickens. I love chickens. I could work with them. But I try to understand wild organisms, insects, birds, etc. So intuitively, you could say, well, the only lab that you could use is the field, because you want to understand what they are doing. Not necessarily if I put a butterfly in a beaker, okay, I can do some observations, but is that of any significance? It's nice to do in a replicate way and apply the big principles of science, but is it relevant? Is it significant for understanding the natural behavior? So there is a kind of trade-off. The field is highly relevant, high level of realism, but so complicated. I can put everything in a small cage, then the world becomes simple, I can do great science, but is it still relevant? So you have this trade-off between realism and complexity, feasibility, if you wish. But in between those extremes, I think that field experiments and a lot of things that are also going on, of course, the field stations where all of you are active, of course, you cover for sure the entire gradient, but I will particularly focus on today on the usefulness of these field experiments, trying to simulate things through the eyes or ears or antenna of an organism in a relevant way, in an experimental way, but taking into account this complexity, but try to reduce it a bit because it's so complicated otherwise to understand it. And what we will do is try to, and over the last few years we are focusing more and more on this, what I think very exciting field of sensory ecology. So really taking into account what is the information organisms get. Trying to combine the information from the sensory organs. And traditionally sensory organs, that was for physiology and more mechanistic studies. Ecologists were just not thinking about, well, I exaggerate a little bit, but it's so interesting to integrate these things and try to get things like sensory ecology in the last few years more and more so cognitive. So how can organisms be fooled and trapped in our environments? I will briefly come to that as well at the end of the talk. So ecology is not only about organism and environment, but there are some filters between. It's about information, cues that they can pick up. And they are, of course, shaped by their evolutionary history, but also there could be aspects of learning which may change their perception or how they deal with information. And these things come together in a complex but very interesting and a kind of eye-opening way, I would argue. This is not coming out of the blue. And perhaps it's interesting to notice that actually the very start of this way of looking at wild animals really started with this trio. Well, you can always say that there are always other pioneers for sure, but in a more official way, these three, so Nico Timberg, a Dutchman, and two colleagues, researchers from Austria, Konrad Lorenz and Karl von Frisch, who together were awarded the Nobel Prize, not for biology. It doesn't exist. What a shame. There is no Nobel Prize for biology. I made a mistake, but nevertheless, they won the prize, and that really stressed even more their contribution. They won the Nobel Prize of Medicine, well, physiology and medicine, for changing the way we deal with behavior. The real serious quantitative approach of understanding behavior. So behavioral biology, ethology, if you wish. Before them, and you see here the time period, so they won the prize in '73. Before that time, there was for long a very dominance of what is called behaviorism, which is the approaches like Skinner with Skinner box or Pavlov with his dogs. We learned a lot from this in a very physiological, mechanistical way, but of course it was extremely artificial, the way they studied. These guys were much more interested in trying to understand in real world settings how organisms behave, how this varies among them, so within and between species. And of course, von Frisch was the guy who also discovered the communication system in bees. Lawrence did a lot of different things, including quite some novel work on imprinting, and so initial learning, how organisms may change their innate preferences. But I will briefly focus on my, well, of course, in a way there are three heroes, but I will, sometimes you have to choose in life. And if I have to select one, then I think Nico Timberger is really the founding father of experimental field behavioral ecology, if you wish. He came up with a series of simple but elegant experiments, trying to manipulate cues with birds and sticklebacks and other examples, where he tried to, because if you only do observational work, you can come up with storytelling. I see this and I see that, nice story, but is it really true? It's so complex, you can come up with alternative explanations. So what he did is manipulating, changing colors, working with dummies, not the real individual, but a dummy, and see how are they responding. Like for a stickleback, if I change the color or if I change shape, does that change the behavior in a territorial conflict, for instance? Really trying to, but that's, and some people in the beginning were a bit laughing, well, is this really serious science? Playing with sticklebacks and dummy sticklebacks? Well, I think that this kind of child's approach to science is so important. It's about creativity. I mean, you could see them as artists, if you wish, because they were thinking differently. No one did it in the same way before. And although if you see it, it can be very simple, it's a great idea to test some complexity, although the experiment itself is sometimes very simple. And I think there is a lot of elegance in this, which gives me a lot of inspiration. It's wonderful work. And actually, this is one of his book titles, The Animal in Its World. Not necessarily our world, its world. It's again coming to this idea of Umwelt. So what we do in my lab is trying to understand natural behavior of organisms and life history variation. Going in the field, observational approaches, a very laboratory kind of work in a very artificial way, but particularly also in between. And that's something I will briefly like to show or walk through. One of our pet organisms we like to work with is a small butterfly, speckled wood butterfly. It's a woodland butterfly, very common species that you can find even at this time of the year when the sun is shining. You can still meet them, particularly in woodlands or wood edges, sometimes even in the heathland. But originally, they were really woodland species, or wood edge species. Since 30, 40 years, we have estimated, also based on genetic work, they are more and more leaving the forest. So they are still, you can still see them in the forest, but now we find them also in agricultural landscapes, we find them in cities since a few years. So they are leaving the forest. I'll come back to that in a minute because that's a significant thing to understand. It's a different world for a small insect like this type of butterfly. But what has intrigued a lot of scientists already since the 70s is the behavior of the males. So what they do in a forest is they select as a territory sunlit patches. So the sun is shining, there is a nice sunlit patch, and then a male will monopolize, will take this site as a territory. If there is another male, there will be a fight, as is indicated here on this cartoon. So they will fight, and you can see there are some rules set. So typically the resident will always win. Why is this? How comes? This has stimulated a lot of experimental research. What we are doing, and that's the point, I'm not going into all the details, but the things we are doing now, we have been working in the field, but at our university, the field station part of our university, we try to simulate this in a semi-natural, or is it artificial way? We are a bit in between. What we do here in a kind of greenhouse is we simulate a forest with even plastic trees. Christmas trees. Never order Christmas trees in April. We did. My student even tried to explain why we needed Christmas trees in April. It's great fun, but then at the other side, no, this cannot be true. Playing with butterflies in cages with Christmas trees? No. Finally, we were able to get them. But if you look at this, I mean, so what we do is we simulate a forest. We try to create this type of light you typically have in a forest, and then we create a sunlit patch. So there is some camouflage netting, we cut holes in it, and then you get this sunlit patch in our greenhouse. We introduce the butterflies, and they seem to be happy they function. So they will fight and they will try to monopolize this. You can say, well, but it's not a forest. Well, apparently, for some of the key cues that they use, it's working. The butterfly has not a kind of forest concept in its small brain. They do have a brain. But they use some cues based on light and light contrasts. If we can simulate this, then it's working. And we can really do behavioral work on this. Here you see a male sitting on one of these fake trees, which allows us, for instance, I will not go in, this is some recent work, where we have tested with different experiments some of their personality traits. Personality traits? Of course, insects can also have consistent behavioral differences. Some are more aggressive than others. This is something you can test in different ways. Then you pitch two males in this arena and try to predict who will win the fight, who will be the guy who will be settled on the sunlit patch. These things are very complicated in the field, but if you simulate this in these kind of arenas, it's working very nicely. I will now focus a bit more on the other work, the fact that they're leaving the forest, which I think is really cool because for its niche expansion. Unfortunately, a lot of organisms, and particularly in butterflies, we have demonstrated that convincingly, a lot of organisms are struggling also here in Belgium, and particularly butterflies. 1/3 of our native species is already extinct, 1/3. Another third is on the red list. So 2/3 is either already extinct or on its way to extinction, which is quite dramatic. We published a paper on that a while ago, Europe's worst case scenario, but that's another story. Nevertheless, this guy is a successful one. It's increasing, and we try to understand why this guy is dealing in a successful way with this landscape, heavily influenced, modified by humans and human activities. So originally it was a woodland organism, now it's still a woodland organism, but the niche, the ecological niche has expanded. It's also making use of small hedgerows, but if you think from a climate point, microclimatic point of view, that's a different world. It's much drier, it's warmer, there is more variation in temperature and humidity in agricultural landscape than there is in a forested landscape, of course. So how does it really come? And how can we understand the differences among these organisms? And one of the classical things you could do, and that's really lab work, is say, well, we capture them. You have some breeding facilities, so climate rooms where you can breed the individuals for a number of generations. Here are 2 generations. And then you will test the offspring, whether they can deal better or not with higher temperatures, for instance. And one of the ideas you could test is that the individuals coming from a forest, their performance, for instance, the number of eggs they lay or the survival or whatever, would be better at lower temperatures, and the ones that are in the agricultural landscape, the warmer environments, may perform better at higher temperatures. So you could predict a shift in the performance curve of these organisms. A nice idea, but you do have to do an experimental approach, quite a lot of work, because that's often underestimated, both by students and the general public, because you have to capture them, bring them to the lab, breed them, 2 generations, think about how to cross them to remain within the ecotype, because we call them ecotypes, so the woodland and the agricultural type. But then you see, for instance, here You keep individual females in small cages in climate rooms, and they are allowed to lay eggs. This is the lifetime egg number they lay during their entire life, either at 20 degrees, 22, 25, 27, so this is the temperature gradient. And then indeed you see that at lower, relative low temperatures, the ones that originated from the woodland landscape are doing fine, which means are laying more eggs when it's cool than the ones from agriculture. But at high temperatures, this flips. And you see that the other ones, as you could predict, so some experimental proof for a thermal adaptation, if you wish. Okay, that's nice. But we wanted to go a step further. And we moved to a very nice research station not far from Stockholm, and it's actually from Stockholm University, a place called Tuvetorp. This is just some of the facilities where you can stay, where you can eat. It's well organized, but they have different facilities, and they focus on zoological research. And what we did there already like 15 years ago, because then we were learning these things, is working in cages. Again, we wanted to simulate forest and open landscape in a cage. You could work in a real forest and try to build a cage in a forest. We do that sometimes as well, but it's logistically, again, complicated. So actually, we learned there in cages of about 30 meters that if you use some camouflage netting and again artificial material, that indeed you can fool these woodland butterflies. And so this is the cage and this is the forest part. Here indicated with camouflage netting, military camouflage netting. And this is an open place, and this is again a forested part. And then, for instance, you can compare between the ecotypes to what extent they're willing to cross boundaries. So this is a forest open habitat boundary, and by just counting the amount of switches they made between the compartments, we have a measure of their willingness to to cross a boundary. This allows us to test some ideas that by having different populations dealing with different landscapes, that a habitat barrier means a different thing for the different ecotypes. And that was indeed, I will not go into detail about the results, but we can do this later on if this is of any interest. But we showed that indeed, for instance, the ones that were originally from woodland were much more making this kind of switches than the ones that came from the more fragmented landscape, the agricultural landscape. So for them, it seems to be a kind of bigger issue, leaving a small woodland, than for the other ones. Which means that it's the same species, but coming from different populations with different landscape settings, this has influenced their behavior, which we could show rather in this field experimental way. We are continuing this, and now these are experiments we did last summer. I'm not going into the details, but I will just show you some of the equipment. So here we release again butterflies, naive butterflies from the different ecotypes, and then we simulate forest conditions in one of the arms, more agricultural conditions in the other, or neutral arms, and we can switch with this to see whether they have some innate preference, one, and two, whether this may change, whether they can learn to switch. I'm not showing the results today because I want to show some more other stuff, but for instance, the ones that have left the forest are better learners. The forest, the native type, is much more, shows the innate behavior, is not changing that much, but the ones that have colonized the anthropogenic environments are quicker and better learners, as we have seen, and they may be more flexible, which makes sense from that point of view. So again, this looks like very, very artificial. Someone from nature conservation would not say, that's not what I would like to protect as a forest. That's not the issue. If it works, it works. And we are trying to see and manipulate in a way to understand the way they deal with the key concepts of their umwelt. We are dealing with the umwelt, and we pick some signals, and that's fine. Of course, a forest is more complex and more beautiful than what we create here. We also play with humidity, etc. Okay, let's move a bit on a broader scale. We we're addressing this question on how the ones that are still in the forest or the ones that colonized agricultural landscapes, do they deal differently with the landscape? Here the idea is there is a target habitat, for instance a hedgerow or a forest, and we can release them from a distance. For instance, at 20 meters, you release the butterflies from a simple experiment. You release them, but again, simple. You have to capture them, you have to breed them, do generations, F2 generation. Wonderful, but a lot of work. But that's not a problem, doing a lot of work, isn't it? That's something students in particular have to learn, they have to work. Okay. You release them at 20 meters, no big deal. They know where to go. You release them in an open field, they don't like the open field too much, they will go in a straight flight to the target habitat, the tall hedgerow or a forest edge. Okay, 20 meters, fine. Let's go a bit further, 30 meters, 40 meters, 50 meters. And so we build a gradient. And of course, after a while, you see that apparently they have to look for a while and aha, okay, they can do the trick. And at a certain moment, of course, you have to do and apply some statistics. Of course, I will not bother you with all the details. But at a certain moment, you can detect a kind of threshold. What is the threshold where no longer there is a significant attraction to the habitat target? So at a certain moment, you release them, and it seems that this target is now out of sight. Is it really sight? Question mark. I'll come back to that in a minute. So, but that allows us to what is called to quantify the perceptual range. At what distance has this butterfly information from its relevant part of the environment being a bit of forest? If you do this, then actually what we observed is that the perceptual range from the woodland, the native populations, is smaller than from the ones that have colonized agricultural landscapes. And it's double the size. So for instance, for the ones from woodland, the threshold level is on average already at 50 meters. For the ones from agricultural landscape, it can be double. At 100 meters, they can already be attracted, which is quite significant, because that means that this is, for instance, a landscape, and in green you see forest. The view on the landscape is different for one ecotype or the other. The ones that come from woodland have a kind of fine-grained view on the landscape. The other ones have information at a wider range, which means that the same landscape is more connected for these guys than it is for the other ones. And there is nothing in the landscape that has changed. It's the same landscape. It's the interaction with the organism, the information the organism really gets and can use. This is what we called functional landscape grain. What is the resolution that makes sense to the organism? Not just us, our maps, that's fine, it's fun, but what does this really mean functionally for an organism to disperse and travel in a landscape? Okay, perceptual range, that is a kind of, it's a quantity, it's a quantitative approach. Perhaps there are differences in the quality of information they use. Therefore, we move to another field station. This is a field station organized by our university in Louvain-la-Neuve. Well, it's no longer on the territory of Louvain-la-Neuve, but it's owned by the university. It's a farm. And most of the research there is done for agronomy, so with cows and pigs and corn and whatever, for the bioengineers or the agriculture engineers. Ferme de Marbais. It's about 40 hectares. But we also, as biologists, can make use of these facilities, and so we can also play around on the fields here, which we did. And it's great fun. It's really playing in an interesting way. So now we were thinking about creating, again, a target habitat, but a fake target habitat. Not a real hedgerow or forest. No, in the middle of an open field, we wanted to create our own target habitat and see if it's working. Some straw bales, so we are in agronomy, so that's fine, we have plenty of them. And then again, camouflage netting, adding, and then there were 2 treatments. So this was used, and so from a distance, at least again from our point of view, well, yeah, that could look like something like a woodlot or something like that. But then we did 2 treatments. Although one treatment was just visual cues only, the fake habitat, and we put some plastic trees before it. Again, our plastic trees. We love plastic trees. All year, but that's the other story. So that's one treatment. There is only visual cues. Of course, the plastic trees can smell, as well, etc. But we assume that this is mainly visual information. The useful chemical information is not there. Chemical information could come from real trees because they produce volatiles, so chemical stuff on which organisms can respond. Because we ourselves are so visual. In the landscape, we think about visual contact. But insects and a lot of other organisms are not only living in a visual world, they are dealing with a chemical world. And for us, it's hard to imagine how a chemical landscape or a landscape of others would look like. So what we did at the second treatment is then we kept everything the same, but we changed the plastic trees by real trees, trees that occur in their habitat. So that's then also a kind of background signal that is available. And does it really matter for the ecotypes? Surprise, surprise, it does. So here you see again, so this is our target habitat, and from a distance, 30 meters in this case, we release butterflies from the different ecotypes. In this case, we worked again with woodland butterflies, agricultural landscape butterflies, but also from urban populations. So we added a third ecotype. So what you see here is, if you release the butterfly, then normally, if it is just by random movements, normally 5% of the butterflies should arrive at our target. You can easily calculate this based on the distance and the size. If it is just random movement, some of them will be lucky and arrive there, but the majority will not. Okay? So you release them, and some will do this, other ones can go the other way around, and then my co-workers and students have to be very sportive. You have to run after them and try to capture them. Sometimes you win, sometimes you lose. That's science as well. Very brief I run you very quick through the results. First, we start with the original ecotype, so the woodland butterflies. It's always, once more, it's always the same species, but one ecotype originating from woodland. So this is the success rate of reaching the habitat target in the sea of nothing. So it's an open agricultural field. This line indicates what they would do. This is random movement. So if it is just they don't see or smell anything, they just 5% of them would arrive there, you see the numbers are much higher. So there is a significant attraction to our fake habitat. Now this is when you offer visual information only or when you add the real plants. It seems that it doesn't matter a lot for the guys from woodland. It doesn't change a lot. However, if you now look to the ones from the different ecotypes, then you see that the relative difference, if they have only visual information, or when you add olfactory information, that changes a lot. If it's only visual information, they seem to be not so performant. But so in a way, and I will not go in much detail, but in a way the relative importance of relying on olfactory information has become much larger in the ones from fragmented habitats, which makes sense if your habitat is at a long distance, because they cannot see so far, but they can smell quite a distance, apparently, or in an urban city where there are a lot of buildings, where visual information is not usual whatsoever, but olfactory information can be very useful cues to inform you as an organism. So we believe that sensory ecology, perception, getting information and trying to grasp this for different organisms is fun to do. It's difficult, there's a lot of complexity, but with clever experiments. And trying to be clever means that simplify things, but in a clever way, allows us to understand more how they respond to their environment. This has actually brought us to some bigger issues, which I will briefly, in the final part of my talk, I will very quickly run through some of these broader ideas. Because we have been working since some time on very basic questions, which I think is again fun. What is a habitat? And this question has been as old as the field of ecology, in a way. Because again, you can see, well, habitat is something, it's external, it's the environment. Or is it rather, with this umwelt idea, the interaction between the organism and the environment? if I take the perspective of an organism, then you could say, we make habitat maps, vegetation maps, that's top down. It's kind of helicopter or drone view, and we make a map. That's forest, that's heathland, etc. That's fine. That's structural habitat as we observe it. Are these units of any functional significance? Perhaps, or perhaps not. And therefore, I think it's important to complement this with a kind of bottom-up approach, taking the perspective of the organism and which are the resources, the conditions, the elements that really matter to the organism. And perhaps then the forest is not the 30 hectares, but perhaps only some parts of it, or for some species it will not only be the forest, although it's called the forest species, but also the heathland just adjacent to it that is used. So we are working now on what we call this resource-based habitat concept as a very performant way to perceive the environment of organisms, and a very helpful way also to inform conservationists, because sometimes the structural habitat or biotope is still there, the forest is still a forest, but some cues or some specific resources are really lacking in this system. So I think this is literally sometimes an eye-opener for conservationists, for students, and the general public, to take the perspective of a different organism and what it really does mean. If you're more interested in we did quite some work on this, but more recently we had a paper on testing this idea and comparing it with the traditional habitat definitions in a number of butterfly species on bog habitat. And we even applied it in very different fields, like on disease ecology, how we can predict diseases, because a disease is also an organism transported by a vector, in this case, a roe deer, etc. And trying to address the same questions in fields where people also developed a very simplistic view on the environment. Forest, agriculture, landscape, point la ligne. No, it's again this more functional, organism-oriented point of view. And the last element in which I think it's very helpful to take this perspective is, we have been doing some work on this since a few years, and particularly on the birds, a bit on the butterflies as well, is when good species go for bad habitats. Ecological trapping. We often assume that, well, organisms, there is selection and nature works fine, so they know what they're doing, right? No, and particularly if we change dramatically and if we play with their sensory systems, if we create some things that they interpret wrongly, then they can make mistakes. There are these hilarious examples of water insects trying to lay eggs on asphalt, on roads, because for them it's water. Asphalt road is not water. I mean, it's the same cue, a kind of exaggerated cue. It's polarization, so they respond to the light. They don't take the river as a concept, they use the light reflection as an indicator of the river. And without our human activities, that works fine. It's a nice proxy. But if we start building roads and etc., then things become mad for them. Some dragonflies may use your car as a small pond. And then the antennae on the roof is excellent for them as a perch. They can sit on it. And you get a stupid animal. No, it's not stupid. We are fooling them in a very particular way. So what we actually see is that normally habitat preference, so what you prefer, should be good for you in a way. So there should be a strong correlation, or a fine correlation at least, between what you prefer, so habitat selection, and the value of that habitat. If that is true, then you're in good conditions, you're from a population point of view in a source. You prefer what's good for you as an organism. Sometimes what's good for you is already occupied and you're forced to accept something of poor quality. That's a sink. You don't like it, but there is nothing else, so you accept it. Then you're in a sink. Ecological trap as a concept is the combination when the organism likes something which is really bad. So then it's trapped. So you see that the preference is high, but the value is low in terms of reproductive success or survival. And there is, of course, still a fourth category, which is the other combination, but both of them have to do with perception, with information that they use, cues. It can be visual cues, can be olfaction, etc. There have been novel studies showing that, for instance, air pollution by cars and traffic is interfering with the olfactory system of moths. Of course, fuel, it's organic material, and a lot of these components for them, so they smell host plants everywhere. When they are in the city, they are completely confused. So it's really pointing at some big issues of organism-environment interactions and pointing at maladaptive components in landscapes where humans change things quite dramatically. All right, it's time for some take-home messages. So I focused briefly on this WYSIWYG assumption, what you see is what you get, and why it may often be wrong. I introduced the Umwelt concept. I briefly showed you, I think, the significance of sensory ecology, adding this to our field to understand how organisms fail or are successful in anthropogenic environments. This helps us to think more in functional terms about habitat concepts, and at the very end, I briefly touched upon this, I think, important concept of the ecological trap as well. But for all of these points, of course, experimental work is so important, and having access to experimental settings, and particularly thinking in a clever way, which sometimes can be very simple, but it's very triggering to do this with students or even young children, old people, all ages can help with this and try to be creative. I think it's about a really very creative part of ecology indeed. And with this, I would like to thank, of course, the organizers for having me, for inviting me. I would like to thank all my students, co-workers, colleagues, and funding agencies. And last but not least, of course, all of you for your kind attention. Thank you very much indeed. Wonderful. If there are any comments, you need a microphone or?
I've got a very big voice.
Excellent.
So I thank you very much for your talk. I really enjoyed it. You raised something that's, I think there are two elements of your talk that actually come together for us as field station directors. And it's the definition of the field. So many years ago, I gave a talk. I never wrote it up to my embarrassment. It was all conservation biologists.
Yeah, for the people who are following us abroad. Oh, yeah, okay.
So I'm sorry to say.
Yeah,
it's
okay.
on. I'm sorry to say, I give a talk. Are conservation biologists habitat bigots, or do endangered species just have poor taste? Because we have.
Exactly.
So you very rightly pointed out that you can have preferences for functional systems that one is surprised about. That's the habitat bigot side of it. We do not think that endangered species are best off in highly disturbed situations, even though they're adapted to disturbance. Or we fail to understand why they're at septic tank fields, or we fail to understand why they're in landfills. It's, it seems co-adapted. There may be negative sides of this. There may be picking up parasites. There may be sort of highly nutritional problems. I think what you raised at the beginning is, what is the definition of a field? Because we are habitat bigots about what the field should be. Your butterflies were adapted to woodland glades long before they were cleared for these more sort of natural or working landscapes. So I wanted you to comment more on how the biases still affect our definition of what species are preferring as habitats.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I think that's a very good and important point indeed. There are several aspects, because there are scale effects that are important, but we have actually, in ecology and natural history, we have a very static view on what a habitat is. And typically that's from an evolutionary viewpoint, that's typically very recent. So of course there are organisms that were a forest species, and if you take the dynamics like tropical rainforest and savanna, for instance, these dynamics, and some specialize to one of them, but others change. So it's true that we have to be more careful about habitat or field definitions, and because they can, for instance, be full, but the other hand, you briefly refer to it, there are also examples of the undervalued. There are some very nice examples in Belgium as well, in industrial sites, where the scenery is ugly to standards of nature conservationists. Some really endangered species arrived in some ponds in the middle of industrial zones, and they're doing very well. They're building up populations, so it seems for them that it's fine. Of course, they could still be trapped if there is a lot of pollution, etc. But it seems that a part of the scenery was not necessary. Of course, this argument, you have to be very carefully and think very, because otherwise you can say, aha, so we just have to put some plugs, some resources in some place, and it's fine for this endangered species, up to the next. Of course, that's again making things too simple. But I think we should indeed think more carefully about what does a habitat signify for an organism and how flexible or static it is indeed. And particularly in systems we have changed. And even several of the more pristine systems, if you think the Amazon is now a lot in the media, unfortunately, but well, fortunately, it depends a bit on what will come out. But even there, you see last year, there was this review showing that native people already for a long, long time modified functional aspects within the forest. And the forest is still a forest from a structural point of view, but they changed functional things for a lot of organisms. For some, it was kind of positive change or modification. For others, it was negative, of course, because they played with which ones are the useful ones for us against the ones that are negative. So yes, I think that thinking more carefully, although it is a very old question from the beginning of ecology in a way, I think it's still important to think more carefully about it and see if we change things, what that really signifies for the organisms. And just observational data will not work. So then I think, again, experiments in your field stations will be key to that. Is that a kind of answer? Yeah, we need a microphone. Okay. Here you are.
Thank you. Very interesting presentation. I have a concern for those of us that have been involved in conservation biology, habitat acquisition, and such matters, that these sorts of arguments about the animals will adapt to whatever open space or whatever you put out there can be used by those in opposition to your habitat acquisition. They don't need the data to make their argument. We would need the data that they will or will not adapt to that changed landscape. Have you confronted us or encountered a situation like this? And what do you say to those folks?
Yeah. Absolutely. Again, a good point. Actually, in my talk today is in a way biased because I've done much more work. And also this, I focus now on one of the winners, if you wish, and this speckled wood, who is a kind of winner. Actually, we use this to learn more about the losers as well, if I can call threatened species losers, which in a way they are. Because if we understand what some organisms can do, that may generate hypotheses about the losers and why are they not so flexible in the way they deal with new systems. And actually we've done quite some work on urbanization, even with a large team which we led in our lab last year. We had a paper in Nature showing that how urbanization is indeed declining and that most species actually are not handling on the short term with the conditions we provide over there. It's too fragmented, either temperature is too high, etc. So you see, again, there are some that are adapting or not adapting, but just tracking the habitat. They come from warmer natural habitats and they invade urban settings. But the general picture of balance of what we see is that most of them, or at least on the short term, are not on a track of being winners. So the view about all this kind of work is moderated. But the important thing is, I think most people, and it will both be so in the States as in Europe, there are few people who really understand evolution and how it really works and natural selection. It's not about a kind of designing thing. It's not that there is an organism that has a problem, so the environment will equip the organism as an engineer would do. This is not how evolution is working. There is not an organism being optimized. Natural selection and how organisms adapt these mechanisms are not extremely efficient. They produce wonderful organisms, we fully agree. But on the short term, you see that for a lot of them, it's not so obvious. And moreover, it works by elimination, which means that to adapt, which means that several of them will not make it. On average, we move up in our trade space, but most of them will fail. So maladaptation, it's not only adaptation, also with adaptation, there is always also maladaptation as the system goes. So yes, I really think it's important also in our communication to be more careful and explain that evolution and adaptation is not a kind of magic trick that an organism wants to adapt and can have all the tricks it has. But that's often the way also journalists often phrase it that way, that organisms are now willing to adapt to the cities and it's great and hallelujah. Reality is a bit more complex, but it's our job to explain this complexity indeed. Yeah, I have to handle over the microphone. Here you are.
You said that you had done some studies on the losers, and I'm wondering if any prescriptions have come out of your work about how we might design disturbed habitats to allow for the losers to become winners.
Yeah. One of the approaches we developed together, actually in the Hoger campus, so in the national park we are here. So in this park, 10, 12 years ago, the managers had a big issue about some threatened butterfly species. They said, well, we have to Belgian standards. Big in Belgium, it's, you know, anyway. So to Belgian standard, it's a large site. Some of the typical heathland species were declining. And said, come on, we have now space. We're really trying to do our best, and they're declining. What's the problem? So then we came along as a kind of A-team. I'm from the, well, 70s actually, but anyway. The A-team came along, and we tried to solve this. And actually, in the beginning, we were puzzled, because we did some transects, we studied in detail, and several of the heathland species were not on the heathland. They were in the edges of the forest. But again, with the very static idea of this is a heathland species, so on the heathland, and the forest species in the forest, I mean, those species don't care about heathlands and forests, they care about resources. And sometimes even species that are sometimes in their name, there is, for instance, Heidevlinder, which is in Flemish the heathland butterfly. If it's really warm, they will not be found on the heathland. They will be in the forest, as we discovered. And we were marking them, doing with several students mark, release, recapture. And at a certain warm day, we were sweating like hell, and we could not find a single butterfly. And we had marked hundreds of them. Where are they? It became too hot. We went in the forest to have our sandwich. They were all there. Now, I think this is really cool. It's just an anecdote, but this is very significant because that means that we, with all our academic knowledge at that time, were not grasping what is really important. But once you understand this, it's obvious. If it is too hot on this space, you will not stay there. You move to something that will provide a suitable habitat. And that explains, for instance, why this butterfly, this heathland butterfly in Flanders or in Belgium, is a forest butterfly if you go to the south of Russia or to Italy, etc., because that's warmer over there. So the same structural habitat may not have the main functional significance. And that's what we learned, that if you take the map of the managers and we said, well, now take the perspective of the threatened butterflies, where are their host plants? Where are the suitable microclimates? Where are the nectar plants, etc., etc.? And we mapped all these, not all of the resources, but some key resources. Then we could immediately see, well, in this zone, there are host plants, but no nectar. And there is nectar, but 2 kilometers. And that's, the scale is not matching with the functioning of the organisms. So sometimes all the ingredients were there, but not at the same scale. And by doing this detailed work, we could show this on maps. And there was a lot of calculations behind it, but the end product was a kind of simple map, which they could use and say, aha, of course, then we have to do this and this and this and this. And this allowed them to improve the functional component of the structural habitat on the heathlands, integrating and not just focusing on the heathland. In the beginning, there was even a different team for the heathland than for the forest. I mean, this is a nightmare if you need gradients and combinations. So these are things we have learned, and yes, you can come up with rule of thumbs for making structures more functional for a series of species which you have analyzed. The criticism that we often get is, of course, but if we have to do this species by species, that's not realistic. I agree. But it's useful to do it for a few species as model systems, because in the end, it's about heterogeneity and variation and gradients. And the more space you have, the lower the need that you really fine-tune this knowledge, because then it's more likely that you will have defined combinations. And that's probably why in really large natural systems, these heterogeneity function for a lot of species. It's in disturbed systems, in human-dominated landscapes, where the space is so limited for the organisms that it does matter if all the resources are there at the right spatial scale from the point of view of the organism. And I think, therefore, we can do a better job in being indeed being under such conditions ecological engineers, and try to understand how we can manipulate these things in a better way to create the heterogeneity that is necessary even at a smaller scale than with completely natural processes.
Hello. Hello. Yes.
A last question. Okay.
Yes. So, about the species and its behavior. Very interesting work, well done, but I was hoping to see something with respect to how the different individuals interact with each other. How do you get perhaps some community, let's call it structure, or some group ecology changes in the whole population? Because in these days it's becoming, biological conservation, there are two trends. One is about conservation of genes that is emerging. The other is emerging about conservation of interrelationships within populations of individual species. A lot of work has been done, I know, on chimpanzees and a few other species as to how these interrelationships change and how that impacts the conservation value of the individual population. So it seems that the model system you said was very good, but it's interesting to see how your opinion would be as to how you can actually detect such changes and how that would be useful in the context of a study like yours.
Yeah.
That's my question.
Yeah, that's a good point. Again, I first proposed to Nathalie to give a 3-day lecture, but that somehow, for some odd reason, that was not possible. We actually did quite some work on personality. I briefly mentioned it. But if you see, even within a population, if you compare among populations or among ecotypes, but also within one, you see that there is consistent variation in the individual behavior. So not the species, not the population, but individuals. So with these speckled woods as well, you have males, individuals, they are marked and followed for a long time, that are consequently more aggressive than other ones, etc. So you can characterize, we have developed other techniques to quantify and also to test the repeatability of the individual behavior. And if it is in a syndrome, we call that then personality. And you can see how these things change. And with this approach, you could again say that's very fundamental, but it has been shown also in other study systems that when environments change, the composition, even if the number of individuals can be the same, but if the behavioral profile changes, their impact on the community can be very different. If they are more aggressive, if they are more explorative, if they are more dispersive or less dispersive, if they are doing more of the same thing, if they are more willing to learn or not, you see so that the behavioral profile and the variation in this profile may change within a population. And this may have huge consequences for the community functioning. An insect could be like on nectaring or pollination. If you think about chimpanzees, etc., of course, fruit dispersion, to what extent they will move seeds around, etc. These things are really interrelated. And I only mentioned this briefly, but you're fully right that also this individual level, biodiversity within the population and behavioral profiles, can be so important in conservation outcome, in an understanding at population and community level, indeed. Yeah, that's a very good point. You're welcome.